Hello, Cardinals, and welcome to today's installment of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. They stood on the rock jetty and looked out to the south, a gray salt spittle lagging and curling in the rock pool. Long curve of beach beyond, gray as lava sand. The wind coming off the water smelled faintly of iodine. That was all. There was no sea smell to it. On the rocks, the remnants of some dark sea moss. They crossed and went on. At the end of the strand, their way was blocked by a headland, and they left the beach and took an old path up through the dunes and through the dead sea oats until they came out upon a low promontory. Below them, a hook of land shrouded by the dark scud blowing down the shore, and beyond that, lying half over in a wash, the shape of a sailboat's hull. They crouched in the dry tufts of grass and watched. "What should we do?" the boy said. "Let's just watch for a while. I'm cold. I know, let's move down a little ways out of the wind." He sat holding the boy in front of him. The dead grass thrashed softly. Out there, a gray desolation, the endless sea crawl. "How long do we have to sit here?" the boy said. "Not long." "Do you think there are people on the boat, Papa?" "I don't think so. They'd be all tilted over." "Yes, they would." "Can you see any tracks out there?" "No." "Let's just wait a while. I'm cold." They trekked out along the crescent sweep of beach, keeping to the firmer sand below the tide rack. They stood, their clothes flapping softly. Glass floats covered with a gray crust, the bones of seabirds. At the tide line, a woven mat of weeds and the ribs of fishes in their millions stretched along the shore as far as the eye could see, like an isocline of death, one vast salt sepulchre, senseless, senseless. From the end of the spit to the boat, there was perhaps 100 feet of open water. They stood looking at the boat, some 60 feet long, stripped to the deck, keeled over in 10 or 12 feet of water. It had been a twin-masted rig of some sort, but the masts were broken off close to the deck, and the only thing remaining topside were some brass cleats and a few of the rail stanchions along the edge of the deck. That and the steel hoop of the wheel sticking up out of the cockpit aft. He turned and studied the beach and the dunes beyond, and then he handed the boy the pistol and sat in the sand and began to unlace the cords of his shoes. "What are you going to do, Papa?" "Take a look." "Can I go with you?" "No, I want you to stay here." "I want to go with you." "You have to stand guard. And besides, the water's deep." "Will I be able to see you?" "Yes, I'll keep checking on you to make sure everything's okay." "I want to go with you." He stopped. "You can't," he said. "Our clothes would blow away. Somebody has to take care of things." He folded everything into a pile. God, it was cold. He bent and kissed the boy on his forehead. "Stop worrying," he said. "Just keep a lookout." He waded naked into the water and stood and lapped himself wet, and then he trudged out splashing and dove headlong. He swam the length of the steel hull and turned, treading water, gasping with the cold. Amidships, the steer rail was just awash. He pulled himself along to the transom. The steel was gray and salt scoured, but he could make out the worn gilt lettering. Pajarito de Esperanza, Tenerife, an empty pair of lifeboat davits. He got hold of the rail and pulled himself aboard and turned and crouched on the slant of wood deck, shivering. A few lengths of braided cable snapped off at the turnbuckles, shredded holes in the wood where hardware had been ripped out. Some terrible force to sweep the decks of everything. He waved at the boy, but the child didn't wave back. The cabin was low with a vaulted roof and portholes along the side. He crouched and wiped away the gray salt and looked in, but he could see nothing. He tried the low teak door, but it was locked. He gave it a shove with his bony shoulder. He looked around for something to pry with. He was shivering uncontrollably and his teeth were chattering. He thought about kicking the door with the flat of his foot, but then he thought about that was not a good idea. He held his elbow in his hand and banged the door again. He felt it give, very slightly. He kept at it. The jam was splintering on the inside, and it finally gave way, and he pushed it open and stepped down into the companionway into the cabin. A stagnant bilge along the lower bulkhead filled with wet papers and trash. A sour smell over everything, damp and clammy. He thought the boat had been ransacked, but it was the sea that had done it. There was a mahogany table in the middle of the saloon with hinged fiddles, the locker doors hanging open into the room, and all the brasswork a dull green. He went through to the forward cabins, past the galley, flour and coffee on the floor, and canned goods half crushed and rusting, ahead with a stainless steel toilet and sink. The weak sea light fell through the clerestory portholes, gear scattered everywhere, a Mae West floating in the seepage. He was half expecting some horror, but there was none. The mattress pads in the cabins had been slung into the floor, and the bedding and clothing were piled against a wall, everything wet. A door stood open to the locker in the bow, but it was too dark to see inside. He ducked his head and stepped in and felt about. Deep bins with hinged wooden covers, sea gear piled in the floor. He began to drag out everything and pile it on the tilted beds, blankets, foul weather gear. He came up with a damp sweater and pulled it over his head. He found a pair of yellow rubber sea boots and he found a nylon jacket and he zipped himself into that and pulled on the stiff yellow breeches from the sou'wester gear and thumbed the suspenders up over his shoulders and pulled on the boots. And then he went back up on the deck. The boy was sitting as he'd left him, watching the ship. He stood up in alarm, and the man realized that his new clothes he made an uncertain figure. "It's me," he called, but the boy only stood there, and he waved to him and went below again. In the second stateroom, there were drawers under the berth that were still in place, and he lifted them free and slid them out. Manuals and papers in Spanish, bars of soap, a black leather valise covered in mold with papers inside. He put the soap in the pocket of his coat and stood. There were books in Spanish strewn across the berth, swollen and shapeless, a single volume wedged in the rack against the forward bulkhead. He found a rubberized canvas sea bag and he prowled the rest of the ship in his boots, pushing himself off the bulkhead against the tilt, the yellow slicker plants rattling in the cold. He filled the bag with odds and ends of clothing, a pair of woman's sneakers he thought would fit the boy, a folding knife with a wooden handle, a pair of sunglasses. Still, there was something perverse in his searching, like exhausting the least likely places first when looking for something lost. Finally, he went into the galley. He turned on the stove and turned it off again. He unlatched and raised the hatch to the engine compartment, half flooded and pitch dark. No smell of gas or oil. He closed it again. There were lockers built into the benches in the cockpit that held cushions, sail canvas, fishing gear. In a locker behind the wheel pedestal, he found coils of nylon rope and steel bottles of gas and a toolkit made of fiberglass. He sat in the floor of the cockpit and sorted through the tools, rusty but serviceable, pliers, screwdrivers, wrenches. He latched the toolbox shut and stood and looked for the boy. He was huddled in the sand asleep with his head on the pile of clothes. He carried the toolbox and one of the bottles of gas into the galley and went forward and made a last tour of the staterooms. Then he set about going through the lockers in the saloon, looking through folders and papers and plastic boxes, trying to find the ship's log. He found a set of china packed away unused in a wooden crate filled with Excelsior, most of it broken. Service for 8, carrying the name of the ship. A gift, he thought. He lifted out a teacup and turned it in his palm and put it back. The last thing he found was a square oak box with dovetailed corners and a brass plate let into the lid. He thought it might be a humidor, but it was the wrong shape, and when he picked it up and felt the weight of it, he knew what it was. He unsnapped the corroding latches and opened it. Inside was a brass sextant, possibly 100 years old. He lifted it from the fitted case and held it in his hand, struck by the beauty of it. The brass was dull, and there were patches of green on it that took the form of another hand that once had held it, but otherwise it was perfect. He wiped the verdigris from the plate of the base. Hesitant London. He held it to his eye and turned the wheel. It was the first thing he'd seen in a long time that stirred him. He held it in his hand and then he fitted it back into the blue bias lining of the case and closed the lid and snapped the latches shut and set it back in the locker and closed the door. When he went back up on the deck again to look for the boy was not there. A moment of panic before he saw him walking along the beach down shore with the pistol hanging in his hand, his head down. Standing there, he felt the whole of the ship lift and slide just slightly, tide coming in, slapping along the rocks of the jetty down there. He turned and went back into the cabin. He'd brought the 2 coils of rope from the locker, and he measured the diameter of them with the span of his hand, and that by 3, and then counted the number of coils, 50-foot ropes. He hung them over a cleat on the gray teakwood deck and went back down into the cabin. He collected everything and stacked it against the table. There were some plastic jugs of water in the locker off the galley, but all were empty save one. He picked up one of the empties and saw that the plastic had cracked and the water leaked out, and he guessed they had frozen somewhere on the ship's aimless voyagings, probably several times. He took the half full jug, and set it on the table and unscrewed the cap and sniffed the water and then raised the jug in both hands and drank. And then he drank again. The cans on the galley floor did not look in any way salvageable, and even in the locker there were some that were badly rusted and some that wore an ominous bulbed look. They'd all been stripped of their labels and the contents written on the metal in black marker's pen in Spanish, not all of which he knew. He sorted through them, shaking them, squeezing them in his hand. He stacked them on the counter above the small galley refrigerator. He thought there must be crates of foodstuffs packed somewhere in the hold, but he didn't think any of it would be edible. In any case, there was a limit to what they could take in the cart. It occurred to him that he took this windfall in a fashion dangerously close to matter of fact, but still, he said what he had said before, that good luck might be no such thing. There were a few nights lying in the dark that he did not envy the dead. He found a can of olive oil and some cans of milk, tea in a rusted metal caddy, a plastic container of some sort of meal that he did not recognize, a half empty can of coffee. He went methodically through the shelves in the locker, sorting what to take from what to leave. When he had carried everything into the saloon and stacked it against the companionway, he went back into the galley and opened the toolbox and set about removing one of the burners from the little gimbaled stove. He disconnected the braided flex line and removed the aluminum spiders from the burners and put one of them in the pocket of his coat. He unfastened the brass fittings with a wrench and took the burners loose. Then he uncoupled them and fastened the hose to the coupling pipe and fitted the other end of the hose to the gas bottle and carried it out to the saloon. Lastly, he made a bindle in the plastic tarp of some cans of juice and cans of fruit and of vegetables and tied it with a cord. And then he stripped out of his clothes and piled them among the goods he'd collected. And he went up to the deck naked and slid down to the railing with the tarp and swung over the side and dropped into the gray and freezing sea. He waded ashore in the last of the light and swung the tarp down and palmed the water off his arms and chest and went to get his clothes. The boy followed him. He kept asking him about his shoulder, blue and discolored from where he'd slammed it against the hatch door. It's all right, the man said. It doesn't hurt. We got lots of stuff. Wait till you see. They hurried down the beach against the light. What if the boat washes it away? The boy said. It won't wash away. It could. No, it won't. Come on. Are you hungry? Yes. We're going to eat well tonight, but we need to get a move on. I'm hurrying, Papa, and it may rain. How can you tell? I can smell it. What does it smell like? Wet ashes. Come on. And then he stopped. Where's the pistol? He said. The boy froze. He looked terrified. Christ, the man said. He looked back up at the beach. They were already out of sight of the boat. He looked at the boy. The boy had put his hands on top of his head and was about to cry. I'm sorry, he said. I'm really sorry. He sat down the tarp with the canned goods. We have to go back. I'm sorry, Papa. It's okay. It will still be there. The boy stood with his shoulders slumped. He was beginning to sob. The man knelt and put his arms around him. It's all right, he said. I'm the one who's supposed to make sure we have the pistol, and I didn't do it. I forgot. I'm sorry, Papa. Come on. We're okay. Everything's okay. The pistol was where he'd left it in the sand. The man picked it up and shook it, and he sat and pulled the cylinder pin and handed it to the boy. Hold this, he said. Is it okay, Papa? Of course it's okay. He rolled the cylinder out into his hand and blew the sand from it and handed it to the boy. And he blew through the barrel and he blew the sand out of the frame. And then he took the parts from the boy and refitted everything and cocked the pistol and lowered the hammer and cocked it again. He aligned the cylinder for the true cartridge to come up, and he let the hammer down and put the pistol in his parka and stood up. We're okay, he said. Come on. Is the dark going to catch us? I don't know. It is, isn't it? Come on, we'll hurry. The dark did catch them. By the time they reached the headland path, it was too dark to see anything. They stood in the wind from off the sea with the grass hissing all about them, the boy holding on to his hand. We just have to keep going, the man said. Come on. I can't see. I know. We'll just take it one step at a time. Okay. Don't let go. Okay. No matter what. No matter what. They went on in the perfect blackness, sightless as the blind. He held out one hand before him, although there was nothing on the salt heath to collide with. The surf sounded more distant, but he took his bearings by the wind as well, and after tottering on for the better part of an hour, they emerged from the grass and sea oats and stood again on the dry sand of the upper beach. The wind was colder. He'd brought the boy around on the lee side of him, and when suddenly the beach before them appeared shuddering out of the blackness and vanished again. What was that, Papa? It's okay, it's lightning, come on. He slung the tarp of goods up over his shoulder and took the boy's hand, and they went on, tramping in the sand like parade horses against tripping over some piece of driftwood or sea wrack. The weird gray light broke over the beach again. Far away, a faint rumble of thunder muffled in the murk. I think I saw our tracks, he said. So we're going the right way? Yes, the right way. I'm really cold, Papa. I know. Pray for lightning.